I did not realize how John Jacob Astor, the fur tycoon, was so reliant on the U.S. Navy in early years. Let's say 1810, the War of 1812, and the 1820s, but it makes sense. At this time, John Jacob Astor was using the U.S. Navy as escorts for his merchant ships, and there are 4 different Navy captains that can be associated with him. Without going into too much detail, because I'm just researching the subject, and I'm not going to focus on all the events with the Lewis Clark expedition, Alexander Mackenzie, who was a British explorer, and Russia when they were considering the territory around Alaska and Canada. So I'm just going to focus on the United States Navy. In an attempt to lay down the foundation so all this would make somewhat sense, we're going to start with, there's the Montreal-based fur company called the Northwesters, and they were competing with John Jacob Astor, who organized the American Fur Company. The first U.S. Navy captain that can be associated with John Jacob Astor was Jonathan Thorn, who served during the First Barbary War. He was with Stephen Decatur during the burning of the Philadelphia, and Jonathan Thorn was known for his temper. So after the First Barbary War ended, stuff happened, and let's fast forward to 1810, or something like that. It's around that time, when Jonathan Thorn was asked to captain a merchant vessel of John Jacob Astor and sail up to the Vancouver, Oregon territory and trade with the Native Americans over there. I did mention that Jonathan Thorn had a temper, and so when he was trying to negotiate with the Native Americans with the barter and trade, things escalated. The captain lost his temper, and he is said that he threw a pelt at one of the Native American chiefs. That didn't end well because the entire American party got killed. And so that was that. I really should have said the Mariners, because Astor's men, they actually created a settlement called Fort Astor. So it was the sailors who got killed. But anyway, moving on to captain number 2 is David Porter during the War of 1812. The Montreal-based company, the Northwesters, told Astor's men that war has broken out and that the British Royal Navy was sending men of war to Oregon territory and take possession of the territory. Astor's men, out of fear of potentially losing everything, they sold a huge portion of their occupied land of Fort Astor to the Northwesters for a pretty pathetic price. But there was one agent named William Price who didn't want to sell out, so he set out and went searching for Captain David Porter, who was said to be somewhere in the Pacific, because there was word that Captain Porter was destroying the British whaling industry. William Price found Captain Porter on the Marquesas Islands. He told Captain Porter the situation, what was happening up in the Oregon territory, but Captain Porter, even though he captured all of these British vessels and he basically had a whole fleet of his own, he was pretty bitter that his contemporaries were having one-on-one Navy battles, and he wanted some glory for himself also. And this is where scholars think that he was pretty foolish about his defeat at Valparaiso, Chile. But anyway, so Captain Porter, he declined going with William Price up to Oregon territory to straighten things out with the British men of war up there. But let's be honest. Let's look at a couple of facts. Captain Porter, his frigate, the Essex, was one of the smaller American vessels compared to the British Royal Navy. that was a unfair advantage because, yes, I did say that Porter had a small fleet of his own, but these were whaling ships, not compared to actual men of war. So even if Porter did go up to Oregon Territory, he wouldn't even have a chance to have the battle that he desired. Unfortunately, all of Fort Astor got sold to the British, and it became known as Fort George. Now we have the treaty again because the War of 1812 ended. So let's look at the situation. Everything was supposed to go back to status quo. The territory lines were supposed to revert back to how it was before the war. So looking at now Fort George, was this a conquest or was this a business transaction? Which leads us to Captain Number 3, James Biddle. 1818, he was ordered to sail up to that area, Vancouver area, and make American presence known up there, which he did. He set up a flag, said, "This is United States territory, blah, blah, blah." And when you looked over at Fort George, who raised the Union Jack, you're like, "I see ya. Okay, bye." That was it. We have Captain Number 4, Charles Stewart. This is a little more complex because during James Biddle's time, James Biddle was supposed to be, well, he had all these different tasks to do. Like Washington, they just kept sending him orders after order after order, like acting like he was like the only captain of the entire United States Navy because everybody else was participating in the Second Barbary War. And so Captain Biddle was, he was ferrying all these diplomats here, there, and everywhere. He had to take American diplomats down to Chile so they could go on a fact-finding mission because Chile was in the process of fighting for the independence from Spain. So, and Captain Biddle was also supposed to protect American merchant vessels from the blockades that was happening in the Pacific. So this man, I mean, like, he had a lot on his plate. And he did his best for the little resources that he had. But when he sailed up to Oregon Territory, it was like the most bare minimum thing ever. Like, it was just like something to check off the list. Now, going back to Charles Stewart continued protecting American merchant vessels while Chile was going through its process of independence, right? Captain Charles Stewart, he has a background in the merchant service, much like most other Navy captains, because that was like a side hustle. However, Charles Stewart had a friend who was smuggling contraband, and it was said that Stewart was turning the other way because he and this friend went way back because Charles Stewart was from Philadelphia, and he would sail in this friend's merchant ship. It was just, what's the word I'm looking for? Conflict of interest. And this friend of Charles Stewart, he was also working for John Jacob Astor. This little thing is kind of like a side note, or a just well, when Captain Charles Stewart got court-martialed because his wife smuggled a royalist spy on the Constitution without his knowing, being friends with this merchant captain smuggling contraband just added to the court-martial. It just like made him seem more guilty because Charles Stewart looked like he was a royalist supporter, and that did not make him look good. So Charles Stewart was indirectly involved with John Jacob Astor, and Charles Stewart was disgraced for a few years because of all these things that just kept accumulating with his wife, and how he appeared to, even though America was supposed to be neutral, it appeared that Charles Stewart was in support of the Spanish Royalists. So Charles Stewart got called back to Washington, and Commodore Isaac Hall came and replaced him, and so Isaac Hall had to smooth everything out in the Pacific.